Welcome everyone. Today I will be talking about developing action gameplay in VR games. Now, as my presentations usually start, I have done another game jam. This one was a VR jam. And for this jam, I decided to develop a VR game which lean more into the action side of things, which is a field where we can observe that usually many VR games, at least like more than half of them, tend to stay away from because it's an area which still comes with challenges which have not been fully resolved yet. There have been some games which did successfully deliver an action experience, like the Gladiator Fighter Gorn, Blade and Sorcery. One could say even Super Hot VR is somehow an action title. But for the majority of VR experiences, we see more of simulations and simple puzzle games, and that's because unlike in normal games, in VR there's still not a standardized formula to deliver certain mechanics, and because you're playing the game in VR, trying to recreate the same experience you will find in a normal first-person, third-person game could be way more challenging and result in issues such as motion sickness to the player. So now I'm going to be talking about my experience and how I approach these challenges and what I learned from them. So the concept for this game I worked on was to combine a first-person stealth action game such as Dishonored. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this franchise, with the core gimmick / mechanic in Super Hot VR, which is time only moves when you do. So the first step was input for the player movement, which was very important, as in an action game, you always want to be able to move and have a good control over the movement. Now, based on my research, there are 4 ways that VR games handle movement. The first and the one with the least issues will be real movement. When you're playing with modern VR headset, the first few headsets that came out, the experimental ones, did not support this one, but nowadays almost every commercial headset has this feature where you have a playable area in the real world, here designated by this blue box. You put on your headset, you can move within the area, and depending on where you are in this area, you also move in the game world relative to a pivot point, which is the corresponding in the game world of the center of the tracking zone in the real world. So you move in the real world, and your avatar moves in the virtual world. Very simple, and this is the easiest to implement, as in no matter who the player is, if they are familiar with VR games or if they never tried VR games, if they have a huge threshold against motion sickness, or if they're very vulnerable to motion sickness, usually this implementation of movement results in no motion sickness whatsoever most of the time. And that's because the reason we get motion sickness is because we see what happens in the game world move while our brain knows that our body is still standing still, so our body feels something is wrong, and it gives us motion sickness. But if you are moving yourself in the real world as your avatar moves in the virtual world, then that's never going to happen. The downside to this, though, is that because you are limited to this tracking zone in the real world, you're never going to be able to cover long distances or move at a certain speed in the game world. So if you as a person, you're not really athletic, you're very slow, you're probably not going to be able to use this to dodge attacks in a video game very proficiently. And if it's a game like The Elder Scrolls, Skyrim, or Fallout, where you have to traverse long areas, this is just not going to do it, because you need to be able to walk a lot and not just walk a couple of meters within your real-life room. Something a lot of games do, and a lot of templates for VR games already come with to solve this issue, is teleportation. which is simply you aim your controller, you release, and you teleport automatically to a different part of the level where you can still move with your real-life body within that given area. Here also shown through that target square that you see on the ground, so that you will be able to see where you will be able to move in the location you teleport to. The issue with this is that it doesn't really fit a lot of games. If you ever played a game like Rec Room, which is some kind of game where it's kind of like a social network kind of game where you can log in on a server and you're going to find other players with their own avatars, and then you can do games together like paintball. So you're basically playing paintball with other people, but then you realize immediately the issue with teleportation in action games, which is it's a dominant strategy. You're about to get shot, you can just teleport out of the way. You need to shoot somebody you cannot really aim to, or you can just teleport yourself next to them. It's very easy to break the game by teleporting around, and it just feels like it's breaking your player fantasy. For example, the Elder Scrolls and Fallout VR ports, for example, they also have teleporting to compensate for the fact that the player cannot realistically move through the environment by walking alone. So you're going to be playing a game like Skyrim, and all of a sudden you can just teleport yourself between enemies. It just breaks the whole combat experience. It breaks the whole way the game was balanced to be. So me and my co-developer on the project, we really disliked the idea of using teleporting as our main way of movement. Another option would be to resort to what's basically the standard in non-VR games, which is using an analog stick on the Oculus Touch or trackpad on the Vive controller to do movement. So you tilt your stick and you move around. That's how it's done, so it should work. The issue is that when you do this, you are creating artificial movement in the game. Your avatar is moving, you see the world around you move with him, but you yourself in the real world, you don't move. So when you do this, your brain feels something is wrong and you start getting motion sickness. Having a game relying on this for movement primarily and only this, it's just a recipe for disaster. A lot of players are not going to be able to play your games. Those that do, they're probably not going to be able to play it for long before getting motion sickness. So you want to avoid it as much as you can. And if you really have to use it, then you want to use different solutions to limitate the amount of motion sickness the player gets. And I'm going to get into that in a moment. But first, the fourth option, which personally is my favorite, is arms locomotion. Is the concept of using your controllers, your motion controllers, to track the movement of your arms. So if in the real world you swing your arms like a runner would, then your avatar in the virtual world is going to move based on that. This has been implemented by a few games so far that I know of. My personal favorite would be Climby, which is a game where you basically have to do bouldering, so climbing a lot of pre-made levels, and you can jump around, run around, and do a lot of other physics-heavy actions, which normally will give you motion sickness, but I found that the game managed to avoid doing that by using solutions such as this one. Because in the real world, you're swinging your arms, your brain feels like you should be moving, so it kind of helps compensating for that lack of real-life movement. And at least to me personally, I found that it really helps to both give me a way to give input, to allow me to create artificial movement, to allow me to traverse big game areas, but also not really come with the downside of creating motion sickness. But for our project specifically, we looked at all of these solutions. And what we decided to do was to implement all of them, not see them as alternative, different ways to do the same thing, but complementary ways to achieve slightly different goals. Let me explain. So one of the main types of movement you want to do in the game is the traversal. So you have a huge level that you want to traverse, go from A to B. How do you do that? So what we did was using the solution of the trackpad or stick in the case of the Oculus Touch to walk, so traditional gamepad-like movement. but also combine that with swinging your arms to move faster. So this way what we have is a combination of both. And I personally found it really helps because the normal walking speed is not too high. So when you're walking through the stick, it's still somehow something the average player can still get used to. But if you want to move faster, then you actually need to move your body, and that helps compensating for the motion sickness you will otherwise get if you were just moving very fast by completely standing still. The second is combat. When you're in combat, you don't want to move as fast or as far away as when you are just traversing the level. You just want to do one of two things. A, you're about to get hit by a sword attack, so you just want to slightly get out of the way, or you want to get a bit more far away just so you have an advantage of the enemy who's going to have to come at you. So what we have there is that we combine real movement in the real world. So if you see that you're about to get hit by a sword, you can literally just take a step back in real life and you're going to be able to dodge the sword very easily. But also if you want to slightly get a bit away to, I don't know, think about your next action or whatnot, then you can actually use your analog stick. Because in this case, you're just taking a few steps back and you're looking at the enemy, so it should not be such a big deal. And that's actually a fun fact. One of the ways to compensate for motion sickness is making sure that whenever you're in the game world and you're moving by creating artificial movements, such as with the stick, you have a point of reference, something which is standing still that you can keep looking at. And the enemy does it in this case. Even though you're walking back, you still as a player want to keep looking at the enemy to make sure it's not coming towards you. So I think, so we found that this is a situation which kind of balances itself. And finally, for teleportation, we do not dislike teleportation. We just dislike the fact that in many games, it's implemented in a way which doesn't really make sense. It feels like it doesn't fit the game design, it doesn't fit the lore of the game, it doesn't fit the fantasy. So what we did in our game, since we took a lot of inspiration from the Dishonored games, we decided to have a teleportation mechanic where you can just aim and teleport, and also do so in midair as well. And basically this helps you with the stealth element to be able to traverse the area in a more stealth fashion, and also approach the enemy in a way that the enemy does not expect. And when it comes to combat situation, we also decided to limit it in that case so that you cannot abuse of it. So we found this is a very nice way to integrate the teleportation, which is probably the best way to handle movement, which has the less risk of giving you motion sickness, but also making it part of the actual design of the game, not some kind of alien element like, at least for me, was in all games I found it in when I was researching VR games. So I talked about motion sickness. If, like in our case, you do have to have some kind of artificial movement, as in analog stick / trackpad movement input, how do you deal with the sickness that inherently comes from doing it like that? Well, the idea is that you can avoid creating sickness in the player if you can somehow diminish their field of view. Because the whole motion sickness comes from the fact that the brain perceives you're moving. But if you somehow put blinders on the player, as in horse racing, what you have is the horses have blinders around their eyes so that they cannot see the area surrounding them, so they can focus. And if you achieve something for the player, what's going to happen is that the player is going to see what's right in front of them, but not the area next to them, so they're not going to feel as they are moving as much. So that is very helpful in reducing motion sickness over time. What we did is, this is how the player view looks like when they're standing still or when they're moving in the real world and turning in the real world. But whenever they start having artificial movement, either by walking through their walking input or turning with their turning input, which is the other analog stick, then we add a vignette effect, which reduces the visible area around them a bit, which helps reducing the feel of sickness. And when they're doing something even more extreme, like falling down or teleporting, then the vignette effects gets even bigger. The idea is that trying to only make the area in front of the player visible, which is the one which is gonna look the most still to them, as it's the one right in front of them, while the one on the side, which is the one which is gonna move the faster and contain the most visual motion to them, that one is the one that needs to be hidden, so that they cannot perceive it, so their brain doesn't feel weirded out by the movement which they see but not perceive, and therefore there's no motion sickness as a result. Now, this is not a method which works all the time. Some people are just too sensible to motion sickness, and they're going to be getting sick regardless. But this is something that has been done a lot in a lot of VR games to kind of trying to fix this issue, at least reduce the symptoms, and allow some players to be able to play for longer periods of time before having to take a rest because of the motion sickness. Next thing is physics. Now, by default, what a lot of VR games have, especially the ones which don't have an action gameplay, is you have your real-life tracking zone, and then in the game engine you have a pivot point being created in the game world, and then the camera moving in relation to that pivot point, depending on where the headset in real life is relative to the pivot center point of the tracking area. Because of this, there's a huge problem, which is if I in real life walk like here, and in the game world here there's supposed to be a barrel or another solid object, I'm going to be able to walk right through. Now, if you have a game like Bartending Simulator, that's not an issue because the player can just walk into the bar, but at the end of the day, they have to take beers and preparing cocktails and whatnot. But if you have an action game, that can be a huge problem because then the player can suddenly walk into enemies and walk into closed doors, and basically the entire game design goes to shame because the player can basically break the rules of the game just because they're not counter rules to make up for what the player can do. So you need to have some kind of physics. And in our case, what we wanted was mechanics such as wall jumping and wall running. So we definitely did need to have proper physics so that when the player is going to try those mechanics, we actually need to be able to detect where the player is in the real world, convert all of that into game world metrics so that it feels like when the player is wall running, they must feel in real life like they are right next to the wall, not like the wall is right next to the center of their tracking area and they are somewhere else in the room, so the wall is far away from them. So our first solution was taking a collision sphere and putting it in relation to where the pivot point in the real world is in the game world. But that creates issues because if the player is over here and they're trying to do a wall run, then the wall run is gonna happen relative to where this little ball is, which means that the player is gonna be standing here, they're gonna be here as well in the game world, but the wall is gonna be there. So this will be a way to imprecise to deliver a good action gameplay experience. Our second solution was the following. We already know that a lot of game engines already have a way to handle characters for action games. So what we did in Unreal Engine was taking the logic which comes to handle VR games, which is a pivot point and your camera, take the logic which is used to handle third-person action games, which is one capsule collider with a lot of logic to jump and run around, and bind them to each other. So whenever the player will move in real life, the capsule of the character will follow them, but also when the capsule of the character will be given some input such as walking, jumping, falling, then the entire tracking zone will need to move relative to how the character is moving. So basically these two independent things, a game character and a real life headset, would be piloting each other at the same time. It worked. The GIF from before was based on this setup, but it's hugely expensive. It's like it's not ideal for it works, but it has so many issues, so many bottlenecks, so many random bugs that it's just not something that we will find viable to continue making the game with. So what I think, at least, what I think would be the best solution, at least from a hypothetical point of view, and I still have not fully tested this, will be the following. You have your tracking zone in real life with a pivot which corresponds to a pivot in the game world. You have your headset which moves independently, but then you also have a series of collisions which are based on the location of your headset, and motion controllers, which is all the data that we can get from the player. We cannot get information about where the body is, but based on these informations, also determine where the player body is likely to be, and then using all of these collisions, determine when contact with other objects in the game is being made, and when that happens, then move the entire tracking area accordingly. Now, this is very programmer heavy, so I'm not going to go into more details. But the basic idea is that we don't really have a standardized way to handle physics when it comes to VR players the same way that we have for normal game characters. Like if you open an engine like Unity or Unreal and you want to make a third-person game, they're going to come with a template which perfectly handles anything that you might possibly need physics-wise. When it comes to VR, we don't have that. We just have a way to make the player see the game world. We don't really have a way to make them interact physically, not a standardized way at least. Right now, we need a lot of custom collision and physics logic to make that work. And for what I observed, that's the best way to go about it, even better than trying to take the existing logic for the third-person character and make that work, because that's just too expensive, and much of the logic which is there is just not going to work as well when it comes to VR games. We have a similar thing going on for enemies as well. What I discovered by having people playtest the game was basically the way I set up the enemies was the same way I would set up an enemy for a third-person action game. So they will have animations, and if you were to damage them, they will have a damage animation. That's it. What I discovered, though, is that players are not happy with that. Players are happy with generic hurt animations when it comes to a third-person action game. When it comes to VR games, players want to feel that the action they are doing, they actually make sense from a physics standpoint. When they will hit the enemy on the face, they wanted to see the face react. They wanted to see the head being cut off. When they will hit a arm, they will want to see that arm being cut off. If they will approach the enemy from the back unnoticed, they wanted to see that their attack will deal more damage. So basically what they wanted was to take the context of the action they were doing when it comes to attacking the enemy and have that make sense within that context. Well, whatever they will do, whatever they will try to hit or cut, that will be the one to react. A generic animation like in traditional games will not work in this context. Same thing for the weapon they will use. If they were to stab, they will want to see the enemy react differently than if you slash them or if you hit them with the blunt side of the weapon. They wanted a very accurate combat system. Which brings me to my last point, which is about body tracking. Of course, because the players were playing in VR and because we wanted this to be an action game, it would not be enough to just have floating arms in front of the players. We needed the player to have a full mesh to represent their bodies so that when they will take damage, it will be localized to that area and not just receive a whole damage on an invisible capsule that they will have. The way we achieved this was by combining two systems. The basic torso and lower body, they are animated traditionally. What that means is that there are a series of pre-made animations which are put together, and based on the direction the player is moving towards and their speed, a different animation will be blended in so that you will have realistic movement. And those body parts are done that way because those are the parts which are not tracked. We have no device to track the player's feet, legs, or torso. So we just assume where they are based on the player velocity, and we animate them accordingly. But for the head, the arms, and the hands, that's different, because then we have the motion controllers and the headset themselves registering data about where the hands are and where the head is and which direction the head is facing. So for those, we use inverted kinematics. What that means in layman terms is we take the location in world space relative to each other. Then we have the mesh also aligned based on where the trackpad, where the headset is, and then we stretch the hands to match the controller locations as well as their rotation, so that whatever action the player is doing, it's somehow represented in the game world. Of course, there are challenges that come with this. For example, my co-designer on the project, he was 10 centimeters shorter than I was. So the first time I sent him the character with the mesh, he was complaining that there was some clipping going on. I tried to ask if it was maybe because he was shorter, and he did not believe that he was shorter than me. He kept saying that we were almost the same height. The problem was probably something else. So what I did, I added logic to detect the height of the actual player, compared with my golden ratio, as in the way that my height compares with the ideal size for the mesh, and then we scale it accordingly. So that's how we discovered that he's actually 10 centimeters shorter than I am, and all the problem was fixed. But that's a very small one, because if you want to have this polished as a commercial release, then you probably want to go an extra mile and not just scale the model, but actually scale individual bones based on the information you're gathering from the player headset and motion controllers data. Which means that in order to do this properly, you will probably need to have some kind of, you will need to be good in vector math to properly do all the calculations, because you only have 3 points of reference in the real world, but you still need to make a formula which allows you to scale everything properly, so it doesn't feel weird for the player, but also make sure everything works fine. So that was it. Thank you very much for tuning in. Sorry if this was shorter than usual. Are there any questions?